There's an old saying that most people are familiar with. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's a relatively simple thing to understand, the idea being that if something works well enough, there's little reason to apply tweaks or overhauls to something that could potentially break that something that has produced results for quite some time. It is a concept that is fairly common to most of the more popular video game franchises these days that sticks with what works and only changes minute aspects that wouldn't rock the boat in any way, shape, or form. After all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But then there's the little known saying that very few people are familiar with, and for good reason. If it's broke but people still buy it, don't worry about fixing it, nobody is going to care. It's not a concept that's well known to anyone except for those who worked at the now defunct Acclaim Entertainment, especially the crew responsible for the various wrestling games that were produced and released from 1998 to 2000. It started with WWF Warzone, Acclaim's first 3D wrestling game which used a control scheme requiring you to memorize pages of button commands to perform the various wrestling maneuvers at your disposal. The game was successful and the formula continued with the follow-up title WWF Attitude, a game that added to Warzone's package with more match types, more superstars, and more play modes. Out of all the Acclaim efforts of the period, Attitude is perhaps the most highly regarded of the bunch. But Acclaim would soon lose the WWF license to THQ, and eventually acquired the license to produce games based on cult promotion Extreme Championship Wrestling, a promotion known more for its hardcore style and graphic content than any semblance of technical prowess. ECW Hardcore Revolution was the first ECW video game ever conceived, and was simply nothing more than a rehashed Attitude. Nothing new, nothing fresh, nothing remotely quote-unquote extreme about this package other than the inherent laziness of the whole thing. But I guess it did well enough to warrant a sequel, and so a few scant months later, Acclaim begat ECW Anarchy Rulz for PlayStation. Side note, there's also a Dreamcast version, but chances are it's pretty much the same game with slightly nicer polygons. And for anyone who thinks this second ECW game is going to be as extreme or hardcore as the actual product it's based on, rated T for teen. Well, that killed the delusion quicker than anticipated. And so ECW Anarchy Rulz still retains the tired gameplay mechanics of its predecessors, and so if you have any semblance of familiarity or tolerance to the more button command style of wrestling title that previous Acclaim efforts brought forth, the learning curve here is relatively non-existent and you should be able to get about as much mild enjoyment here as you did the previous efforts. However, while the overall game engine is pretty much the same, Acclaim did make some changes to the system. For one thing, there's something of a logical progression that you have to follow in matches, where you start applying some lower tier holds and attacks which are surprisingly simple to pull off here, before you start building towards the more complex but more powerful attacks and eventually your finishers to finish the match and all that, theoretically at least. Of course, response time in executing moves still isn't fantastic, especially now that the gameplay has seen a somewhat notable boost in speed. Compared to its predecessors, Anarchy Rulz feels a touch faster, giving it a pacing that is quicker than the slothfests of past entries in the series. The increased speed, the slightly polished mechanics, and the simpler but not that simple command inputs makes for a more intense gaming session to the point where the AI becomes quite a bit of a challenge even on the lowliest of difficulty settings. Once you get used to the mechanics, it shouldn't be that much of a problem, but expect to lose a few rounds before things get better, assuming they get better at all, because at the end of the day, despite the refinements made, it's still the same engine as before. The response time and button commands still feel a bit laggy, the collision detection has a tendency to botch every so often, the control scheme still not as smooth or fluid as one would like, and even with some of the positive upgrades made to the engine, it was feeling its age even back in 2000. By the time Anarchy Rulz arrived on PlayStation, we were too busy playing SmackDown. We gave Anarchy Rulz a couple pity playthroughs here and there, probably had more fun creating characters than we did actually playing the game, and then we went back to SmackDown. Of course, if you were an N64 owner, you didn't even get Anarchy Rulz, but then again, you had no mercy, so I don't see what the problem was there, but I digress. Now, the gameplay might be a somewhat significant hurdle to overcome, but if you're willing to jump that hurdle and make the most of it, you'll find that ECW Anarchy Rulz does have some major additions to the package that makes it better than its predecessors, mostly in the form of some new moves, slight tweaks, and most significantly, a ton of additional match types and options to keep you busy somewhat. For what it's worth, Anarchy Rulz may very well be the best of the Acclaim offerings, strictly going by the multitude of match types and options. In addition to the usual stuff from the previous games such as death matches, first blood, cage matches, and barbed wire matches to go along with the career mode that people like, you now have table matches, brimstone matches where you toss your opponent into the fire and he spontaneously combusts as a result, dumpster matches, backlot brawls, and there's even an MMA style octagon thrown in for good measure because sure, why not? There's more stuff to dig into, and I'm only giving a quick glance at these things because there's no real need to spend 5 hours explaining that a hate match is one guy versus 3 stables of 4 wrestlers each, or that backlot brawls take place in the backlot, and things of that nature. But is all this additional content worth enduring the cumbersome control setup, the flaky collision detection, the lame duck crowd reactions, and the somewhat clunky gameplay mechanics that's more of a holdover from a previous license than anything else? Again, that's dependent on whether you're willing to put up with those particular sticking points, but they at least tried to beef up the content, and that's worth some brownie points. You still have the various creation tools of past games, the create a wrestler, create a pay-per-view, customize an arena. They all work the same as before, fairly intuitive and workable, but like the rest of the game, it's pretty much old hat with nothing really new to offer. ECW Anarchy Rulz looks just like its predecessors, somewhat decent, although messy looking textures with somewhat blocky caricatures and occasionally shitty looking blood splats that appear whenever the hell they want when the situation calls for it. The overall look of these acclaimed wrestling titles never seem to change as far as the aesthetics and presentation goes, although they did add a couple neat camera tricks here and there, so that's something I guess. The character models are still somewhat nice and clean looking, something you don't really get from the SmackDown series of the time, but they tend to move about stiffly and robotically. Even the faster speed doesn't help in disguising this point. If anything, it sort of emphasizes that point even more. Of all the things that could have seen improvement, I figure trying to make the action flow a little more smoothly and lively, as much as was possible on the PlayStation 1, would have been top of the list underneath the gameplay bits, but like I said before, don't worry about fixing it, people will buy this stuff anyway. It is unfortunately a philosophy that is just as relevant and active today as it was way back in the day, before and since Anarchy Rulz. Much like Hardcore Revolution, ECW Anarchy Rulz ditches the real ECW entrance themes with cover versions because ECW back in the day liked using real songs from real bands, and trying to put those songs in a game that could potentially have a wider audience than the product it's adapting might be a hard hit for the wallet if you get my drift. And the cover versions are nothing to write home about, although some vaguely sound like the songs they're trying to cover, I guess. The rest of the audio seems to have been culled from the previous game, save for some brand spanking new commentary tracks from Joey Styles and Don Callis, as well as some new wrestler voice bites, but it's still the same crowd noise, the same cheap sounding sound effects, the same sameness as it were. There's supposed to be some new music from Dope and 1 Minute Migraine, but I'm unfamiliar with their music, so I'll just take their word for it. Sorry, that's all I got. Overall, ECW Anarchy Rulz is perhaps the most featured-filled entry of the Acclaim offerings. With plenty of match types, ring types, and stipulations to fiddle around with, the game gives you plenty of toys to fuck around with, and that alone gives it a bit of replay value. And that probably makes Anarchy Rulz the best of the Acclaim offerings of the time, and the minute changes to the overall speed and command inputs makes things a little more bearable, but at the end of the day, it's still the same game that was around for 3 releases prior, with a lot of the same issues that plagued the engine, and with that state of staleness that has grown a little less overwhelming with the extra dressing, but is still there in some fashion. Like I said before, it doesn't matter how much crap you stuff into the game if the core gameplay itself isn't worth a damn. That having been said, fans of past Acclaim efforts like Attitude or Warzone will get into this one easy with packed content and match types. However, if you've never cared for any of the Acclaim games during the PS1 era, then there's nothing in Anarchy Rulz that's going to change your mind. Newcomers looking to dabble in the ECW ring and have the patience to get acquainted with the wrestling engine might get some enjoyment for a short while. Who knows, you might even like the game enough to try the other titles in the series. but otherwise it won't be long before one longs for something significantly better and more accessible. Not to mention, significantly less tame than what's featured here.
New Jack, having a hard time getting up. Balls, stay away. CW,